Hello everyone, that was a lovely introduction, thank you so much. My name is Ashton, this is Chris, we're from the University of Southampton. We're going to present some research today on conspiracy theories. Before we start, I need to give a little prompt. There will be lots of propaganda in this presentation, but none of it is insidious or horrifying to look at in nature. We're going to talk really quickly, and there is loads of pictures. So if any point at the end you want us to go back and explain anything in more detail, please do keep a note of it. So we collected data following the US withdrawal of Afghanistan, the month following that, on Twitter and Gab, to look at the role that the mainstream and the fringe play in this dissemination of propaganda. I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to give the initial results, and then I will come back towards the end.
So we identified 4 things that we've dubbed superchargers, so things that kind of really helped the conspiracy theories become viral and also more enduring. So I'm just going to talk through these. The first is the obvious cognitive dissonance of what occurred. How could a military that spends more than the next 9 nearest countries, which is backed by an enormous military entertainment complex that convinces citizens that this is the finest military in the world, be subjected to a humiliating defeat and withdrawal by an indigenous insurgent force? Now, actually getting to the bottom of that and understanding it is an incredibly complex problem that will take years and years of study, with documents and materials that simply the vast majority of citizens don't have access to. And even if they did, the years it would take to understand this does not serve as a balm for the discomfort of the misunderstanding of how this could happen in the first place. So instead, what we found was people reaching for simplistic explanations. They range from corruption to placing it within the lines of plots. So this was part of a globalist NWO, this was part of a replacement theory, or treasonous false flag, 9/11 was an internal job kind of narratives. The second thing that we found that supercharged these beliefs was things that reached out for historical precedent. And here I just want to indulge my historian background for a moment to just kind of put this into a little wider context. So the idea of finding a specific document, the kind of smoking gun of evidence to base a conspiracy off, is a key part of all conspiratorial groups, in particular on the far right. So what I've chosen here, this is an example, you'll see here, this is a newsletter from a right-wing American group in 1965 in which they referred to a specific State Department document that was going to lead to the disarmament of the United States through the UN. Now, that document does actually exist. It's produced in 1961 by the State Department, and it's part of a series of conferences when the United States was competing with the Soviet Union over who could take the moral high ground over disarmament. So it is real, but it's a piece of propaganda. It was never policy, but that's not the point. The point is it exists as a document, a piece of evidence, stripped of context. So we see this document again and again and again. Here it reappears in America Under Siege. Some of you will be aware of this book, very popular with the nascent militia movement in the early 1990s. And you can see that exact document referenced here. So now it has become part of the conspiratorial law. The key difference between a period of social media and then was that in order to buy into this conspiracy theory, you had to already be in the scene. The book was sold at gun shows. You signed up to newsletters, or you phoned up specific recorded phone lines to find out about these conspiracies. The difference now, of course, is these things are just keywords thrown onto memes which are then put out there, which sure enough, if you search these keywords, you will indeed find evidence. Here with Iran-Contra, for example, of the United States under the Reagan administration illegally providing aid to state and non-state sponsors of terrorism. And so, sure enough, you can find those documents, again, stripped of their wider context, but that provides the smoking gun. And it's not just documents, but also images were a key part of this. So we saw the repetition of certain images. Reagan here meeting with Afghan Mujahideen representatives. So this was the public outreach part of the covert Operation Cyclone, part of the Reagan doctrine in the 80s. This image was reposted, only this time these were described as Taliban. You have to ignore the fact that there's a woman there in the Oval Office. Or there were then extra versions. So the images on the side here, these are modern versions of those images. So here you can see actually even the furniture of the Oval Office is repeated in this fake image of Biden. And the fact that actually Reagan is not really meeting with the Taliban, doesn't matter, because in the image, the skin tone, the ethnicity, the national dress is enough in people's minds to draw this connection between the US government and the Taliban. The third factor is things that overlaid with fronts of the culture wars. So there were memes and posts that aligned the death of US service personnel during the withdrawal with the election fraud. This wouldn't have happened under Trump, for example. This is part of the Stop the Steal issue. Or this clip I'm going to show you now from Judge Pirro for the NRA aligns it with Second Amendment gun rights debate.
The administration that wants to ban us from owning AR-15s just handed over 359,000 rifles, 126,000 pistols, and 64,000 machine guns to the Taliban.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47.
Yeah, unless you're a terrorist, then we'll send you one in a gift box for free.
So the last part that supercharges these conspiracy theories then is when these things overlap and cross into mainstream content. And for this, I want to use this meme, which is from which we drew the title of this paper. And you can see it aligns with that Second Amendment gun control debate again. But importantly here in the background, you'll see an infographic produced by the Times and the Sunday Times. So, you know, theoretically credible quality journalism. Now, the statistics you'll notice... The statistics you'll notice from this infographic, which went very viral after the US withdrawal. This was spread all around social media, which, of course, is one of the goals of modern journalism, where they kind of leaned into viral content, taking a beat from things like BuzzFeed to try to basically drive readers to their pages. Well, you'll notice the statistics from this infographic, which are in the background behind the Talib, are the same statistics that Judge Pirro was citing there in the NRA piece. These were wildly inaccurate, and actually down here you'll see the correction, which was a lot less viral, that the Times then had to publish, because what these figures actually are is all military aid provided to Afghan national forces from 2001 to the withdrawal. So this is in no way a reflection of what the Taliban inherited. But once it is endorsed by quality media, it takes on that extra virality. And it's just worth, as my last point before I hand over to Ashton, I just want to say that actually the Times has serious form for this with this war, and what's quite impressive is they bookend this war, the beginning and the end, with two very influential and very inaccurate infographics. So this one was published within the first 2 months of the war. It was actually based upon a New York Times interview with a former Russian soldier that made its way through the Independent and then eventually here in the Times. But this fantasy fortress actually ended up being used by the Bush administration itself to justify the necessity to pivot from terrorism as a crime paradigm over to a war paradigm for the sheer scale of what they were dealing with. And on that point then of kind of that mainstream crossover, I'm going to hand over to Ashton.
So, anyone that knows my work will know that I do memes. For my PhD, I looked at about 20,000, right? I'm really interested in them, how they attract people, why you might be attracted to the mainstream narratives. So some of you might have seen these delightful images circulating following the takeover of the Taliban in fairgrounds, right? We saw this with Islamic State, so during religious festivals such as Eid, they would open these theme parks, part of their utopian strategy of trying to appeal to families, right? Made them seem like they're not constantly in these war zones, it's actually a very normal society. And this actually dates right back to the Klan of the 20s, when they also used this strategy as part of their 100% Americanism, framing themselves not as a terrorist organisation, but someone that was pro-white. And they would often have these kind of events as a means of attracting families. This is very similar to what we've seen with the Taliban in this kind of softened down strategy that they're putting out through these theme park images. In addition, we have the Taliban using food in their propaganda. This was obviously a troll of Biden when he was seen being trolled on Gab in particular for getting ice cream. Again, we've seen this with Islamic State using Nutella as a way of attracting the West. We see this with the trad wife movement, with the cure mums, right? Part of what my work does is looks at this intersection between the fringe and the mainstream. How can a social media company determine whether or not Spitfire bunting or scones are just a scone at a tea party, or if it's some sort of insidious narrative? And this is a picture from an eco-fascist group called Green Line Front, operating on VK. So often when we're using these kind of images around food, they are coded, right, to circumvent restrictions. So the use of the pig here to present this kind of lovely community in which we care for animals is actually a code word of who's excluded, right? Because traditionally, Jewish people and Muslims don't eat pork. So you see this a lot in images. We also have the seduction element, right? I used to do a lot of research into Islamic State. Why do so many young women join? Because they use attractive Western men in their propaganda. This was a meme that was put out on Twitter by the Taliban. And we also see this with the far right all the time, right? The idea that you need to be this masculine, dominant culture. This dates back to the Third Reich. You see this a lot in identitarian propaganda, right? That softened down approach, trying to attract people through seduction. We also see a lot of copycatting when we're looking at memes, particularly in the crossover between the far right and the Taliban ones, and both Gab and Twitter. So this is the original that was shared by the President of Poland when he was referring to today's wokeism being the same kind of plague that his parents fought against communism back in the day. I forget the day, which is why I said back in the day. And as you can see here, you're fighting against wokeism, LGBTQ plus rights, communism. Now, we see a lot of these images in support of the Taliban, and we'll get onto why the far right, particularly operating on Gab, support them. But this idea that Islam, and more importantly Sharia law, will protect you from these really scary things up here. Women's rights, LGBTQ plus communities, but despite being pro-Taliban, you also see within these memes liberal articulations of Islamophobia, right? There's still anti-Muslim sentiment going on here. The idea that Islam is oppressive to women is something that the far right will constantly use within these kind of narratives. The other meme that I want to talk about quickly before I hand back over to Chris is this one, which is cut out at the top. Anyone that was in my presentation yesterday will know that I do a lot on this recycling of history, alt histories, right? This idea that we need to look to the past and this illusion of utopia to provide some sort of evidence of what a future ethno-state would look like. So actually up here what you have is Europe for Europeans, Afghanistan for Afghans, God wills it. Now use the traditional figures historically that represent this clash of civilizations between Christianity and Islam. The Crusaders, right, they are always used in memes to represent this. They use these historical figures against the new enemy, right? The new enemy is them joining together to fight against this wokeism. Traditionalism against modernity is key within this. And then when I return to my key points at the end, we'll go back to why the far right is supporting the Taliban so much. I'm going to hand back over to Chris. He's going to talk a bit about the next meme.
So this meme as well here again, a pro-Taliban meme. You'll notice that you have the pride flags burning on the front of the embassy here. And this was picking up with a trend that had been occurring online related to the US military. This idea that wokeism and progressivism had undermined the American military capability. And this has particularly come to the forefront with two advertising campaigns. Russia released a new advertising campaign which relied very heavily upon very traditional images of masculinity, whereas the United States campaign, the Go Army campaign, used various serving US service personnel who gave backstories which were then animated. And the point of the US military campaign was to reflect the diversity of the US forces. So these were individuals from a range of backgrounds. In this particular case, it was a young woman raised by same-sex parents, and who then joined the military and was kind of talking about her inspiration. And this was seen, as you can see here by some of these responses on social media, as a deliberate decimation of the capabilities of the US military. There was this sense that in some way focusing upon microaggressions and critical race theory as opposed to the sorts of things that Afghan fighters focused upon, that this was the reason that the United States had lost. And in the same way, with the other examples there we were talking about of that overlap into the mainstream, we can see how this kind of culture war battle actually bubbled its way right the way up to Fox News and the Washington Post, publishing pieces on this. And then the Taliban tapping into that, and pro-Taliban accounts tapping into that as being a reason for American military decline. So, on to our conclusions. The first point I would raise here is that at its core, this conspiratorial idea of doing the research isn't a bad thing. Especially in a state like the United States, where limited regulations mean citizens do have to be alert and do have to be aware of things that are put in food, of things that are prescribed as medicines. There is a need for citizens to be careful and to pay attention to what is going on around them. So intrinsically, this isn't necessarily a bad idea. And when it comes to something like understanding the defeat in Afghanistan, the idea that people are naturally inclined to do research is a good thing that could be utilised and pushed in the right directions. One of the key problems we have is that individuals like myself publish explanations of these things in books that are then published by university presses, are either expensive or difficult to access, or in subscription journals that the vast majority of people don't have access to. And there is some move towards open access, but it's still siloed off in academic spaces. And so there is some sort of way, there is some sort of collaboration that could occur here that would make accurate information that would help direct people away from some of the more simplistic explanations. This is not a good example I've posted here, by the way. I understand this would not be a popular meme, but there is somewhere, people that are good at this could collaborate with historians to try to take some of that research out of our more drier productions and put it somewhere that people could actually access.
It's like musical chairs. Yeah, my 2 key points then. So I argue a lot in my work that far from being a one-directional process, so people think about mainstream a lot as the extreme entering the mainstream, right, one way. I found in my research that it doesn't actually work like this. So extremist propaganda is also drawn from mainstream narratives, and these are often modified and fed back through the coding and cloaking in the propaganda. So social media companies, people that are trying to combat this, need to take into account these fuzzy, blurry boundaries between this more softer, toned-down imagery. On Gab, in particular, which was where I conducted most of the research, was for the far right on there, the Taliban accomplished what many of them hoped to achieve in the West. This idea of overthrowing a democratic system through armed struggle and violence to create this pure ethno-state that they have all been seeking, particularly identitarians. So actually, taking this into consideration, the mainstreaming and why they are so pro-Taliban and the way that they are coding and cloaking these narratives is quite important. Thank you for listening. We look forward to any questions.